Today we're going to be looking at subtracting decimals, so let's get started. When subtracting decimals, you're going to follow the exact same procedure you would as if you were subtracting any other number. The first thing you need to do though is just make sure that your decimals are lined up properly. Once you see that they are, you can place a decimal right below, right here, to make sure that it's going to be there at the end and you don't forget to put it in. I like to do it at the start just to get it over with and get it in there. And then you can just start working your way through the numbers. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start over in my hundredths, and I'm going to see that I have 7 subtract 4 in the hundredths, or 7 hundredths, take away 4 hundredths. That leaves me with 3 hundredths here. Then I move to my 3 subtract 1, that gives me 2. I then have 5 subtract 2, which is 3, and 9 subtract 8, which is 1. That leaves me with 13.23. When taking a look at this example, I have 85.31 subtract 23.53. The first thing I do is I double check that my decimals are lined up, and since they are, I am going to place a decimal place right here just so that I don't have to worry about that later. Then I'm going to move to the far right, take a look at my hundredths place value, and I'm going to start the subtraction process. Looking at the hundredths column, what I see first off is that 1 subtract 3 can't be done. The 3 is greater than the 1. So I actually have to borrow from the neighbor in the tenths column here. I'm going to borrow 1 from the tenths, leaving me with 2. And I'm going to carry 1 over, 1/10 over to the hundredths, giving me 11 hundredths subtract 3. 11 subtract 3 is 8. Now when I move to the tenths column, I have 2 subtract 5. Again, I can't do that, so I'm going to jump over the decimal place here to the ones place value, and I'm going to borrow 1 from it. And that gives me a 4 here, and I'm going to carry the 1 over to the tenths column, giving me 12 tenths. 12 subtract 5 is 7. And 4 subtract 3 in the ones column is 1, and 8 subtract 2 is 6. This leaves me with the answer of 61.78. Here's an example of a subtraction problem where the question is written horizontally. So now I need to stack my numbers on top of each other just to make it a little easier. I could do the mental math here, but we're going to stick with the standard algorithm here just to make things easier for the start. So what I'm going to do is when I write this, I need to make sure that my decimals are lined up, and I have to be really careful when I do that. So I'm going to rewrite it here. I have 1.06. I'm actually going to place my decimal place under here before I start writing so that I can write 0.14, and that makes sure that everything is lined up here. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to place my decimal in my answer right away in there, and you can see I've just placed that in there, and that allows me just to pop it in there so I don't forget to write it in. The next thing I'm going to do is just start over on my right hand side and just start subtracting through the numbers to just make my way through. So I'm going to start with my hundredths over here, and that's 6 subtract 4. That leaves me with 2. And then I move to my tenths, 0 subtract 1. I can't do that, so I actually have to borrow from across the decimal here my ones, and that leaves me with 0 and brings that 1 over here. So now I have 10 subtract 1, which is 9. And in my ones column, I have 0 subtract 0. That leaves me with the answer of 0.92. Here's another example of a subtraction problem written horizontally, except you'll notice in my first number, 7.548, there are 3 digits in the decimal or in the decimal places here, and in my 0.7 there's only 1, so I really have to make sure that these are lined up properly. Let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is write my 7.548. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to place my decimal place here just so that I know where it is, and write 0.7. And because I'm going to write because I have nothing underneath the 4 and the 8 here, I'm going to add in zeros just to make my life easy as placeholders. I'm then going to subtract these. I'm going to place my decimal down here in my answer just to make sure I don't forget it. And now I'm going to start. 8 subtract 0 is 8. 4 subtract 0 is 4. 5 subtract 7, I can't do that because the 7 is larger, so I'm going to jump over to the next place value. I'm going to borrow from it. I'm going to take 1 away and bring it over here. 15 subtract 7 is 8, and 6 subtract 0 is 6. This leaves me with the final answer of 6.848. Alright, in this final example, we're looking at 60.00 subtract 25.33. We're going to do this in two ways. The first way, we're going to borrow across a bunch of numbers, and it's a little more complicated. And then I'm going to show you a little bit of a trick here to help you with numbers that look like these. So I'm going to stack these on top of each other first. I have 60.00, and I'm going to place my decimal place here, and I'm going to write my 25.33 here. I'm going to subtract them. I'm going to pop my decimal place down here. Now, as you can see, the very first thing I'm going to do is subtract my furthest to the right, which is the hundredths, and I can't do 0 subtract 3. I can't borrow from my next door neighbor because it's a 0. Moving over to the ones digit place value place, there's a 0 there again, so I actually have to borrow from the 6 here. If I take 1 away from the 6, that leaves me with 5, and it brings a 1 over to the ones column, giving me 10 in the ones. I'm now going to borrow from the 10, leaving me with 9, to bring 1 over to the tenths column, leaving me with 10 tenths. I'm now going to borrow from the tenths column here, leaving me with 9, bringing 1 over, giving me 10 hundredths. Now I can do 10 hundredths subtract 3 hundredths. That gives me 7. I'm going to then go into the tenths column. 9 subtract 3 gives me 6. And now moving into the ones, 9 subtract 5 is 4. And 5 subtract 2 is 3. This gives me a final answer of 34.67. A bit of a trick to help you with these questions where you have to borrow across a whole bunch of zeros is to actually change the numbers you're working with. So let's take a look at this. When I take a look at my 60.00, I'm going to take away 1/100th from this number. When I do this, I end up with 59.99. I'm now going to do the same thing to the 25.33. I subtract 1/100th from that, and that leaves me with 25.32. Now when I stack these numbers on top of each other, it's very, very simple to subtract them. I'm going to put my decimal place here just to start off, and then I'm going to move all the way to my far right. 9 subtract 2 is 7. 9 subtract 3 is 6. 9 subtract 5 is 4, and 5 subtract 2 is 3. I end up with the exact same answer, but no borrowing. To recap, all I did was take 1/100th away from both numbers. So 60 became 59.99, and 25.33 became 25.32. By taking 1/100th away from both, I end up with the exact same answer as I would if I just did the subtraction with these two original numbers. It's a really nice trick. Hopefully you feel comfortable enough now to jump in and start trying to subtract decimals on your own. Good luck!